I see people slowly trickling in, so I think I'll just kick it off and then everybody can join and watch the intro later if you so desire. But hi, everybody. Thank you so much to our panelists and for all the attendees for coming. I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. I'm Serena. I'm a 3L at Berkeley, and I'm one of the co-editors in chief of the Berkeley Journal of African American Law and Policy. And today is our symposium / lunch talk event that we're doing in collaboration with the Berkeley Journal of Gender, Law, and Justice. So I'm going to hand it over to Jessica Williams to introduce herself, and then I'll briefly introduce the event and we'll get started.
Thank you, Serena. As she mentioned, my name is Jessica Williams, and I'm a co-editor-in-chief of Berkeley Journal of Gender, Law, and Justice. I wanted to begin with our land acknowledgement, which applies to Berkeley. We encourage you to look into the land history of your place wherever you are. We recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. As members of the Berkeley community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also we recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. In recognition that Berkeley journals benefit from this history, Berkeley Journal of Gender, Law, and Justice pays the Shumee land tax as a way to contribute to the healing of this history, the sovereignty of Ohlone people, and the preservation of their culture. And from there, I'm handing it back to Serena.
Thank you for reading that out. So today we've got a really great panel here to talk about some pressing issues at the intersection of race, medicine, and health more broadly. So we decided to call this conversation Reclaiming Black Health for a number of reasons. Black people and our bodies are constantly under scrutiny by the state, by society, etc. But we're also simultaneously being marginalized and discriminated against to the point that environmental and medical racism continues to wreak havoc on the health of our communities. So we hope that this conversation is one step in many towards reclaiming some time and space for Black people and scholars and practitioners to recognize pertinent issues facing our community, identify solutions, and maybe reject framing of health that centers whiteness. And a question that I hope we can all consider throughout the discussion is, what does it even mean to be healthy? Why is the metric usually based on Eurocentric standards? What does it mean to strive for health and health equity? Even when some people will never be quote unquote healthy, but they still deserve our compassion, care, and autonomy over their bodies and their lives. So I want to thank everybody for attending. And thank you so much to everybody who worked so hard to put this event together, especially my co-editor-in-chief, Maya Harmon, who is going to be moderating Q&A throughout the event. So if you have any questions, you can chat them either to her directly or to the panelists, and she'll review the questions to ask later in the event. But first, we're going to start just by introducing our panelists, and then we'll pitch them the first question so they can get started on the conversation. I think, Jessica, you're going first.
I can see that. Dr. Zoe Julian is a practicing obstetrician gynecologist, educator, and researcher rooted in reproductive justice practice. Their work is focused on community participatory models of healthcare and clinician training across the Black sexual, reproductive, and perinatal health continuum. In partnership with transdisciplinary scholars, educators, and advocates, she developed Structures in Self, a structural health equity curriculum used throughout the United States and Canada. And we are also joined by Savala Trepchinsky, who is a lawyer. Savala Nolan Trepchinsky, who is a lawyer, writer, and lecturer. She teaches a course on movement lawyering at Berkeley Law here, and is executive director also here of the Thelton E. Henderson Center for Social Justice. She and her writing about race, gender, power, and privilege have been featured in Vogue, Time Magazine, NPR, The Nation, The Huffington Post, and more. Her memoir, Don't Let It Get You Down, Essays on Race, Gender, and Body, will be published by Simon & Schuster this July.
Thanks, Jessica. And we also have Professor Michelle Goodwin here. Professor Goodwin is the founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy and is credited with helping to establish and shape the health law field. She directed the first ABA accredited health law program in the nation, and established the first law center focused on race and bioethics. Her exceptional emphasis on exceptional health law scholarship ranks her among the most cited professors in the field. And finally, we're joined by Professor Osagi Obasogi. Um, Dr. Obasagi is the Hawes Distinguished Chair and Professor of Bioethics in the Joint Medical Program and School of Public Health. His research and writing is on bioethics and examines the past and present roles of science in both constructing racial meanings and explaining racial disparities. He has a particular interest in developing legal mechanisms that can create the conditions for eliminating health disparities. Thank you all for joining us. And I'll pitch the first question. And anybody's welcome to jump in. Or maybe Professor Goodwin, you can start with this one. We wanted to start with, in what ways are Black people as individuals or a community pathologized or blamed for their own illness and harm? So we've seen the ways that medical professionals believe Black people are higher risk for diseases like type 2 diabetes and heart disease because of cultural phenomenons such as like soul food diets, which are associated with Black communities. We've seen the way poor women, and poor Black women in particular, are denied adequate care or even criminalized for getting pregnant. So maybe you can speak to that first.
Sure. Well, let me go back even further, because I think the origins that we began with recognizing the indigenous lands in which Berkeley stands and all of our country takes us back to the time of colonialization, the raping and robbing of land, and as well the kidnapping and trafficking and rape and torture, quite honestly, of people who were from Africa. And so the pathologization that you speak to, one could say, begins there with the pathologizing of Black people's desire to be free, such as the terminology of drapetomania, which was a medicalized term to make it a pathology to want it to want to be free, which is just strange, right? Who would want to be shackled, chained, and indentured to a life of unpaid servitude where so many abuses and harms befell people who were from Africa and brought to these lands? Who would want to stay shackled, picking cotton, cutting sugar cane, being referenced as chattel and not full human being? And so from the very origins, there is that. And if you think more deliberately about the journey of Black people throughout their legacy in the United States, there's never been a pause for empathy. And that's hard for people to grapple with. But if you really just kind of level set with it and you say, well, oh, during the period of slavery in the United States, the federal government was complicit, the United States Supreme Court was complicit, state courts were complicit, state legislatures were complicit. There was no empathy for the experiences of Black people. And instead, the federal government set up platforms for people to be able to go and kidnap Black people from elsewhere or to render Black people to come back. This the fugitive slave laws. So we know quite explicitly that record of no empathy. And if you think about the record of Jim Crow, one in which the Supreme Court helps to usher in, rendering almost meaningless in some ways, the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, creating this separate but equal society that's enforced by police. We've seen those images of the snarling dogs, the powerful water hoses, and police wielding their batons. And again, and lynching, right? And again, not a time of empathy. And so when we then think about what comes out of that time, the sort of lack of empathy, we also see the pathologizing of Black people. And I'll just really quickly in the last minute say this, which is that whether it is conditions such as you mentioned, diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure, these are the pre-existing conditions that are born about through racism. And these pre-existing conditions that are born about from systemic and structural racism are ones in which Black people are blamed for. You have hypertension and high blood pressure because you choose not to live a better life. Or on the other hand, it follows a pattern such as race itself, which is a social construction, which is to say that Black people experience these conditions because of their race. Even though race is not a biological thing, it's not something that one can say has that. And there's much more that we could say about that, but I wanted to take the time to level set in a historical context because it's not just contemporary what we see. And let me just end with this. This has been a very challenging time over the last year, over the last week, with the trial of Derek Chauvin, the killing of Dante Wright, the video of Adam Toledo, and then following all of that, the horrors that happened to the young girl in Columbus, Ohio. So, with all that said, there's a lot of trauma too, right? That is important to acknowledge, and the legitimacy of acknowledging that trauma that communities across the country are experiencing.
I think we're meant to go in the order we were introduced, so that makes me next. I really appreciate the level setting and sort of getting us within the framework of history and the way that you did. And I just have to say before I give my real answer that I really appreciate being in a space with so many brown faces. It's very unusual when you are in, the professorial or sort of upper part of the law school administration to be in these kinds of spaces. And I'm deeply appreciative, especially given the kind of week on top of all the other weeks that we've been going through. So my first thought when I was looking through these questions, in what ways are Black people pathologized or blamed for our health outcomes when they're poor? And snarky person that I am, I was like, well, in what ways are we not? That was my first thought. And it's snarky, but I think it's true. Part of how oppressive systems survive is by constantly moving the spotlight from the system to the individual, so it's like, oh, pay no attention to the system behind the curtain. It's the Cheetos that you're eating, right? And so I think it is unconscious, but intentional, right? It's unconscious for many people that they're agents of this kind of moving of the spotlight. But the movement is also like, it was created. I think that, in that way, the situation that Black people face around health and healthcare in this country is not unique, right? Because systems are always trying to say it's not political, it's personal. Of course, our history is unique, and the depth and the intricacy of the systems that have been oppressive and continue to be oppressive is somewhat unique, right? We're just beginning to really grasp at the level of kind of popular culture or kind of dinner party conversation that racism itself is an impact that's negative on Black people in particular, but anyone who's subject to it, even when you adjust for money and so on. I mean, the flurry of statistics around Black maternal health and death and suffering. One of the reasons I think that those sort of caught the imagination of the culture is that it doesn't matter how much money you have, right? Those statistics account for money. So I'm hopeful that maybe the conversation is beginning to widen and become more sophisticated. I think we're also just barely beginning to understand as a culture how tiny the role personal choices play in health outcomes, that employment, housing, zip code, debt, language, literacy, access to healthcare, like those things are part of the puzzle, huge pieces of the puzzle. So that gives me hope, but I still think that as a culture, we treat being healthy, whatever that means, as a moral issue and a moral failing if you're not healthy. But we don't treat, providing the conditions for good health as a moral issue in the same way. And that hammer comes down, of course, like all hammers, heaviest on the people who are farthest from the power, and who the culture is primed to see as immoral, amoral, incapable, out of control, and so on. And Black people fall into that category so often. The last thing I want to say, because I mean, we could all go on and on, but I want to pass the mic, is just to put a pin in the fact that, of course, this is intersectional, and, you know, as all things are, and that there are particular ways that Black women are exploited, undernourished, harmed, particular ways that Black trans people are, Black men, Black children, and so on and so forth. So, you know, as it so often is in this culture, race is the tie that binds, but there are many intricacies and many different sort of grotesque ways that the pathology or the pathologizing is tailored to who we're talking about, whether we're talking about children who, you know, like Ma'Khia Bryant, some have said, well, she was so fat that she was like an adult. You know, that is a very grotesque and particularized form of pathologizing her experience and her killing. So yes for intersectionality. And I think with that, I will pass the mic to one of my co-panelists.
So thank you. And I think the thoughts that we've heard thus far have been really helpful in shaping this conversation. I want to add I want to add to this conversation by highlighting the particular role that science and medicine have played in pathologizing Blackness, and really introduce the provocation that science and medicine are constituted by notions of race, racism, and racial power that have not really been faced or dealt with as acutely as they should be. So one thing that Professor Goodwin highlighted was this long legacy of race and racism and how it shaped this conversation, and how, if you really want to understand what's going on, you really have to go back to the founding of this country and how notions of race and racism shaped who was a citizen and who was not, who was property and who was not. And in particular, we can understand the creation of racial categories as an opportunity to kind of artificially place boundaries on humanity to justify who could be a person and could participate in our democracy, and conversely, who was not able to do that. And I want to emphasize the word artificial, right? So part of this idea of race is that it reflects some type of natural difference in human beings, that this difference comes from either God or nature or something else, but that it kind of, it has always exist. And what scholars of race have kind of really shown over the past several years is that race is an artificial distinction, that these boundaries do not reflect anything inherently different between groups, but rather they reflect social and political processes in which certain people are marked as good and other people are marked as bad. And this artificial process has been crucial to the founding of this country, and moreover, the various institutions that have emerged. And it's important that not only that these understand that these differences are artificial, but it's also important to understand the institutions that have emerged to make the artificial seem natural. That is to say, that to cover up the artificial processes in which difference is created, to make it seem as if not only that the differences that seem salient, to make them seem like they're natural or inherent, but then also to justify the maltreatment that comes from that, as if that is a natural way to treat people poorly because of this difference itself. And conversely, that it makes sense somehow give privileges to other groups who are in a dominant position. And what I want to, I think, add to the conversation is that medicine and science have played a critical role in justifying the way that we not only think about groups, but also distribute resources and opportunities along those lines. That is, that this pathologization of Blackness has been a critical part of how medicine and science have evolved over the many years, and the ways in which medicine has gone out of its way to justify these artificial distinctions as some type of meaningful articulation of how and why various disparities persist in our communities. And this has had a critical impact on how our society has not only historically evolved, but how we're dealing with understanding health disparities to this very day. So when we talk about things such as, why Black folks have shorter lifespans, or are more likely to be predisposed to certain diseases, the kind of reactionary statement that we see from so many physicians and researchers is that, well, it's just something in their genes, or there's something that predisposes these groups to these poor health outcomes. And we have to understand that this framing of the issue is tied to this long legacy of race and racism, and to the extent that the inability of these medical institutions to be fully accountable for understanding how we kind of produce these disparities through how we treat certain people, rather than this being a reflection of who these folks are. So I think it's important to understand the institutional contributions, how organizations and institutions thought to be neutral and apolitical and simply interested in health and wellness have emerged from a context where it has become central to their endeavor to understand race and racism in ways, or I should say, a failure to understand race and racism, and how that, in a sense, produces a situation where we continue to talk about poor health outcomes as a function of who people are, rather than as a function of how groups have suffered for many, many years. And we really need to not only change the conversation, but change the way that medicine and science do their work.
I'll hop in. I could not agree more with my colleagues about the critical nature of setting the historical sociopolitical context to the modern day inequities that persist, and to just further reinforce the intentionality behind creating conditions that perpetuate those inequities. I have lots of thoughts, really kind of, I think that will help synthesize and kind of materialize how a lot of the ways that these different systems of oppression impact communities and people in real time when they're trying to access healthcare. But before I do, I just want to take a collective breath. We are talking about a persistent history of racialized violence against the communities that most of the people on this call are a part of. And doing that, even as scholars, even as professionals, even as educators, researchers, myself a clinician, we are still actively impacted in the work that we do when that violence is perpetuated against people we see as our kin. So I want to just offer a moment of silence for Ma'Khia Bryant, the 16-year-old who was killed by a police officer in Columbus, Ohio earlier this week, for Jada Peterson and Remy Fennell, the 8th and 9th Black trans women to be killed and murdered within the last 4 months, and the 14th and 15th trans or gender expansive person to be killed this year. So if we could just offer a moment of silence for them and a chance to reflect. Thank you. I appreciate y'all sharing that pause with me. So yeah, as I said before, I could not agree with all of my colleagues more. I see the way that racism is baked into the training and education of medical practitioners and other healthcare providers. And I think it's really critical to call out the way that capitalism and racialized capitalism in our society also helps to further drive these inequities, drive the structures, the policies, the practices within healthcare systems, hospitals, medical schools, and academic institutions and universities that further, as I said, exacerbate and enable these injustices to persist. And one really tangible example that I'll give, even in the best of circumstances where someone is fully insured, is able to access healthcare, whether it be with a physician, a nurse practitioner, a physician's assistant, a midwife, a different type of healthcare provider. Even when they're able to schedule an appointment, feel welcomed and seen and valued by staff as they make their way through their visit. The way that our current system is developed is such that in the average healthcare setting, someone gets about 15, maybe 20 minutes tops with their provider. And that doesn't change much, whether this is your very first time meeting someone, whether it's a return visit, and is kind of irrespective of the type of care you're seeking, whether you're going to a primary care provider or whether you're going to a subspecialist for a really complicated issue. And the only reason that that is the case is because of the medical industrial complex. The only reason that we're limited in our time spent with people is because an individual person who brings with them their traumas, their lived experiences, their joys, they are reduced down to a commodifiable unit, a person to be moved through the system. And so myself as a provider, I'm allotted a specific amount of time because I'm expected to see a certain amount of people in a day. For me as a full scope obstetrician gynecologist, that can range from 20 to 25 people in a day. And the way that that is then reflected back even into clinical training is for physicians specifically, all medical students who are pursuing further education and licensing have to complete 3 different tests in order to become a legal physician in the United States. One of those tests includes an in-person exam where you're expected to meet, interview, examine, diagnose, and treat a patient within 15 minutes. The only reason that that's a part of our training and expectation for licensure in our country is because of the medical industrial complex, because of the need for a provider to be able to function as a cog in the wheel in that system to continue to move people through to generate more and more revenue. And we know that because of the history of the United States and the way that all of my colleagues have painted that picture, that racialized capitalism has always been a part of our history. And so the way that system impacts people of different races is different. And the ways that providers therefore take shortcuts is inequitably distributed across people from different races. So I think it's key to keep that perspective as well as the way that capitalism further drives all that we're discussing.
Thank you so much. Our next question is picking up on a couple themes that have come up already. And Savala, I'm going to be pitching this to you first. So how do alternative health approaches, including holistic medicine, nutrition and diet plans, and community support fit into the narrative of Black health?
I thought a lot about this question, partly because it's outside my wheelhouse, right? So I had to, my professional wheelhouse. So I had to really think about it. And here's what I came away with, and I can't wait to be educated by my peers on the panel. On the one hand, I think alternative health approaches are incredibly valuable. Because health is dynamic, right? We think of health as like an on-off switch. I think it's more like a series of intersecting spectrums, right? Your mental health can be great, your physical health can be not great. I mean, it's dynamic. And I think that alternative health approaches and spaces get that a little bit more. They tend to honor that a little bit more than the sort of highly capitalized parts of the healthcare system. In my life, they have been important because they provide a little bit of shelter from the capitalistic impulse of sort of mainstream healthcare. And if I can get a Black or brown provider in that alternative space, like all the better, right? Because it provides me a little bit of shelter from the white gaze that can be so problematic in the medical space, and that has been, in my life multiple times. So I think they're incredibly valuable from that perspective, or at least can be. At the same time, I think that the biggest threat to Black health is racial hierarchy, right? Just like the biggest threat to women's health is patriarchy, and the biggest threat to trans people's health is cisnormativity, and so on. So it's easy for me to imagine alternative health spaces that don't really divest from the racial hierarchy, and that therefore kind of perpetuate in certain ways the very thing that they're meant to be an alternative to. So I think it's a complex question. And and I want to hear more from the people around me. And if what I've offered is just meaningless based on your expertise, I can take it. Correct me, please. Those are my thoughts.
I'll offer that your lived experience is an expertise and therefore
Yes, it
could
is.
never be useless.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yes.
That's true.
So I appreciate you sharing it. I'll just jump in and offer specific to sexual reproductive health. We've mentioned maternal mortality and morbidity already. I think it's paramount that I uplift the treasured profession that is Black midwifery, with also within our society's history. Yes, strong thumbs up, Professor Goodwin, because just as Professor Goodwin laid out that history of settler colonialism, of commodification, capture, torture of Black bodies, so too has carried the tradition of Indigenous and African midwifery from the continent and on this continent, and integrated into the ways that Black and Indigenous communities always cared for one another. So this is history that I have learned from granny midwives, Black and Indigenous midwives who are close colleagues, friends, and mentors, as well as doulas and other birth workers. And so often I find it frustrating, a bit maddening, but not surprising that there continues to be this question: how do we solve maternal mortality? How do we solve disparities, racial disparities in maternal mortality, the Black maternal health crisis? And in my mind, the solution is very obvious. It comes through Black midwifery. It comes through Black birth workers and Black doulas. It comes from actually the most traditional ways in which we used to care for one another. That because of racialized capitalism, because of white supremacy, because of all of these systems of oppression we speak of, have been decimated. And there were, again, to reinforce the deliberate, purposeful nature of that phenomena. If you look back at the rise of my profession of obstetrics and gynecology, which walked hand in hand with a need to provide justification, scientific and medical justification for the perpetuation of slavery. You think of folks like J. Marion Sims, who is often dubbed as the father of modern gynecology, who performed countless of experiments on enslaved Black women against their will, inherently, because they were enslaved, but also without anesthesia. And that history was the beginnings of a way to perpetuate medicine, and specifically obstetrics and gynecology, as a field of paramount knowledge, expertise, and skill to help really maintain an enslaved workforce. That's really the origins of a lot of the institution of medicine and a lot of specific specialties. Certainly it's true with obstetrics and gynecology. And so as that persisted, there became a medicalization and a capitalization of birth, for which OBGYNs were seen as the authority, and therefore midwives could no longer be the authority because that would challenge that system. And so there was a concerted, what's the word I want to use, smear campaign, quite frankly, also legislated with different laws around scope of practice, around legality and certification required to assist folks through birth. And all of that, again, was a concerted effort to decimate a treasured profession that, in my mind, is the answer to a lot of our health problems. So that's just one kind of specific example about quote unquote, what we now deem as alternative models of care or alternative types of providers, who are really our most traditional treasured ways of being and caring for one another.
I suppose I can go first, but I think all right, let me just jump in there. So I so appreciate the lifting up of Black midwives and Indigenous midwives. I mean, even to think about the fields of gynecology and obstetrics and what they are now is this sort of perfect storm of trying to get rid of them, and actively doing that around the time of the Civil War, and using, even so when we think about the structures of racism and institutionalization, using the American Medical Association as a conduit to actually do that. Doctors like Horatio Storer and Joseph DeLee, who then used the American Medical Association as a tool for lobbying Congress, states, to make licensure requirements for midwives. Nearly 100% of reproductive health care for women had been done by women, and they were Black, overwhelmingly, Indigenous, and then also some white women. By the turn of the 20th century, that 100% was down to about 1% because these men had been very successful at wielding these campaigns that were also backed by white supremacy and racism. They wrote about the need after the time of the Civil War for white women to go spread their loins west and south and north. And the Civil War provided a perfect backdrop for it, just in the same way that racism provides a backdrop with regard to immigration and other kinds of concerns regarding the browning of the United States. There's a concern about the browning of the United States then too. And so, the sort of racism has been a very powerful tool. White supremacy has been a very powerful tool. And it's worth noting that when we think about those structures and what happened, right? Abortion had not been criminalized in the United States prior to that time, but it becomes criminalized by these same people who are trying to get rid of Black women as midwives. And if you think about it, if they hadn't been gotten rid of, and clearly they continue to exist because the knowledge base continued, but in terms of the wide birth of them, can you imagine what that would have been like after slavery's over, having this kind of profession where you're respected for it and can, build your own capital instead of being shut out? But to think about the kind of pernicious structural ways in which this happened too, the American Medical Association, which welcomed and adopted the kind of platforms that were being pushed by these guys, also barred Black doctors from admission, if you will, or from being able to become members. And in the 1800s, they spoke about, well, the reason why we need to bar Black doctors from being members of the American Medical Association is because Black medical schools don't ban women. And so when we think about the intersectionality that we've been talking about through this, program, that's really important to lift up. But there's one other issue that you raised, which, related to what our neighborhoods are like, the kind of social determinants of health, food deserts and things like this. Well, those things happen to be real in the lives of people of color and Black people. It's a shame that it makes national news when a Whole Foods or a Trader Joe's decides to locate in a community that is predominantly Black, which it shouldn't. That doesn't make national news when they locate in a suburb. But the fact that it does says a whole lot about the ways in which Black people have also institutionally and structurally within local governments not been provided the same kinds of accommodations, advantages that white communities have. And that is including incentives for, the Whole Foods, the Trader Joe's, et cetera, to locate in low income Black communities.
Yeah, and just I think to add another layer to this conversation, I think it's also important to be a bit critical of the medical model of health, and how that traditional medical model is fixated on individual and the individual as a site for health and wellness, to the exclusion of understanding the social and political and economic determinants of health. And so that has led, I think that has been particularly harmful for people of color, in part because so many of the health problems that occur in communities of color are tied to the environments in which Black and Brown folks live. And so they have social and environmental determinants that shape these health outcomes for individuals. And oftentimes the medical model misses that because it's so focused on the individual. And not only does that focus on the individual miss the social and environmental determinants, but also feeds into the pathologization of Blackness because it locates the problem as being in some type of natural difference of Blackness or something inherently wrong with our genetics or physiology. So I say that to suggest that if one takes seriously that the social and political determinants of health is an important factor in the health outcomes of communities of color, alternative approaches can speak to those determinants in ways that are much more appropriate in addressing these health problems in our communities. So I think one advantage of thinking about alternative approaches to medicine is that their more holistic approach can really speak to the roots of health outcomes and poor health outcomes in communities of color. And that attention to those roots can be quite beneficial for many people of color.
Thank you so much. I wanted to offer another question, which is related, I think, to a lot of kind of the consequences of these systems of oppression you guys are bringing us back to time and time again. And we've seen throughout the pandemic and COVID-19, especially in the vaccine rollout campaign, that Black people in media or online in the Twitter sphere, which I happen to be in too much, Black people in communities have been painted as having the most vaccine hesitancy, and they're the ones circulating conspiracy theories, and Black people are afraid, and it's either real or not real skepticism. Even though some studies and evidence have shown that it's actually less white people plan to get vaccinated than Black people. So for those in the Black community who may actually be hesitant, bearing in mind this history of structural racism and oppression, prioritization of white health, how do we compassionately approach encouraging more people to get vaccinated if that's the answer? And what do you think causes some of these disparate realities that it's actually white people that are expressing the most hesitancy, but it's getting blamed on, once again, the Black community and our resistance to what it's called traditional health, which really just means the modern model of medical health care.
Mhm.
And I'll pitch it to the entire panel. I'm not sure who wants to go first. It's totally fine to go out of order.
I'd be happy to start there. So you're right in terms of level setting that sometimes whether it's drugs and the perception that Black people use illicit drugs more often than white people, we know that's not true. Black pregnant women use illicit drugs more than white women do, such the crack mom and what. So not true. It's just that Black women were 10 times more likely to be reported than white women, and white women actually exceed Black women in terms of alcohol during pregnancy. So across a number of factors, those it's just wrong, right? Like the data is just wrong. And even in these spaces too, right? The anti-vaxxers before COVID were largely wealthier white families. It wasn't that Black families were always able to keep up with vaccination, regimens for their families, but it wasn't because they were anti-vaxxing for their kids. It's homelessness, it's moving around and needing to, find the next person who could provide this medical care. But it wasn't that. That coincides with a reality that we do know, which sometimes we pitch too often to, but is real, such as the horrible experiments that took place in Tuskegee. But one need not have just Tuskegee to know that Black people are not treated well in the medical sphere, right? I mean, so it's kind of like a love-hate kind of thing, right? There are way too many studies, including the Institute of Medicine's, book from the early 2000s, that is nearly a 700-800 page book that just mark all of the kind of health disparities that are experienced. And the only area where Black people were more likely to get care than white people was amputation. Black people were 2 to 6 times more likely to have a limb amputated. So it's something like the only area where you are likely to get better care, or not better, more care, is that something gets chopped off of you. So it's like those kinds of backdrops that would naturally make anybody suspicious, but it's overblown in some ways with regard to the current vaccine. But to your point, with regard to how do we do better, well, I think that part of this conversation is that we need more people like the people on this call to be in medicine and to be conveying and communicating and in the communities, and treating with respect and gentleness these kinds of concerns. That's what we need. We need information, we need access, and we don't need shaming, and we don't need people sending us away. And if you look at the people who were dying, Black people who were dying during COVID in the early stage, and I'll end here, there could be a narrative like those Black people just didn't care about their health. Some of the cruelest, most tragic stories were these Black parents who were taking their kids to the hospital, taking their kids to the pediatricians, and being sent back home over and over again. So it's a false story that Black people don't care about their health, that they're not trying to be well. We need to tell a story about Black people being pushed out, shut out from American healthcare.
Mhm. Mhm. No, I agree so much with Professor Goodwin. The way vaccine hesitancy has been talked about has just been really a shame. And in particular, as Professor Goodwin touched upon, this notion that vaccine hesitancy was driven by uh, historical experiences like Tuskegee, rather than the very real contemporary experiences that many Black folks have with healthcare. It was a really cold and cynical way to use a past horrifically traumatic experience to obscure the continuing forms of discrimination that occur within healthcare. And that move that we saw in the media over and over again, to me, was just so inappropriate. In terms of how to fix this is just access, right? This is just a question of access. If I can go on Amazon.com right now and order something and have it delivered to my house within a day, we should be able to figure out how to bring vaccines into communities to make sure that folks have access to this type of treatment. And it's really a question of what commitment do we have to making sure folks are able to get vaccinated. Not everyone can take time off of work. Not everyone has access to get to a vaccine site. We really need to kind of double down and make sure that we couple education around the vaccine with access to make sure that folks can, to make sure that folks can get this vaccine and make sure them and their families are safe. And to me, that's much more of a social and political commitment than anything that that needs to be done within the Black community itself. I think Black folks are open to being vaccinated. Black community is open to these conversations about the need for these type of public health initiatives. It's just making sure it's available to everyone, regardless of their resources.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's critical to consider the necessary public health infrastructure that has not been created, developed, invested in, or utilized during the course of this pandemic at many different steps. You can think about access to just the basic materials that people need on a regular basis, hand sanitizer, masks, and how that differs dramatically based on whether you're housed or not, based on your race, based on your gender, based on whether you're dubbed an essential worker or not. I think also there's a great need for, as my colleagues have been talking about, the need for really mobilizing community health workers, public health nurses, other types of trusted people in communities to be able to couple education with actual access to the vaccine. I think the current vaccine rollout has been wildly inequitable. As true with most things in the United States and within US healthcare, if you have enough money, if you have the right amount of privilege, you're going to get access to the critical resource and other people won't. There's been numerous reports of folks coming from, white people coming from affluent neighborhoods and areas in specific metropolitan areas, coming into poorer communities of color, bogarting their way into getting access to vaccines. So even when the vaccine is being brought to people's backyard, they're still not able to access it. So we really have to think about access in a really nuanced and complicated way. And I think too, again, it is appropriate for any person to be skeptical of a new technology that was rapidly developed during a global pandemic. That is an appropriate, logical response to information. And to pathologize that response, specifically amongst Black people, again, is another example of this specific and targeted messaging that pathologizes Black folks in the US.
Can I just really quick tap on that? I just put in the chat a video that maybe, that should be disturbing to us all, and it is. And if you aren't familiar with this case of Mrs. Barbara Dawson, which was before Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and whatnot, I think it just level sets for this conversation, because here was a Black woman who couldn't breathe, called an ambulance, got in the ambulance, was taken to a hospital. At the hospital said, "I can't breathe." The hospital called the police on her. The police come and disconnect her oxygen, and she doesn't even make it into the squad car. Not that like being arrested at a hospital should be a thing. She dies right by the squad car. Why? She had a blood clot in her lungs. This, I think, says so much about how we need to reorder what it is that we see about healthcare, and also law enforcement being used as a tool that undermines Black people's healthcare.
Right. And if I can add to that point, Professor Goodwin, it also shows the the sharing of carceral logics across law enforcement to medical professionals, and the level of suspicion that medical professionals have with Black folks when they go in for healthcare, and all of a sudden have the police called on them, and how that in a sense contributes to inequitable healthcare. Because there are many instances where Black and brown folks don't seek care because they are aware of these synergies between medicine and law enforcement, and they continue to have poor health outcomes or die because they don't want to be incarcerated or worse simply because they're having a health issue. And so we have to really talk about this relationship between medicine and police, because we see it in so many different circumstances. A lot of my work now is looking at the relationship between coroners and medical examiners and law enforcement when it comes to use of force incidents. And we're not talking about how medical professionals are providing cover for law enforcement when they beat, kill, and maim people of color as part of their law enforcement duties. So and we see this happen in a lot of different circumstances. We see paramedics partnering with law enforcement and using chemical restraints in the field. We see so many instances. And so we have to talk about these collaborations and relationships between medicine and law enforcement and how that produces poor health outcomes.
Yeah, I'll just quickly offer another really pertinent example of that is the criminalization of substance use in pregnancy, and this very close relationship between child protective services, which often functions just in the same carceral nature that law enforcement does, and healthcare providers. And so, Dr. Obisogie, I cannot underscore enough the comments you're saying about the parallels between the carcerality within multiple institutions that intersect with health.
These are really wonderful. This feels like a good place to take a break until 1:05, just because the second portion will be very much about the confluence of all of these things. So we'll take a break, but we wanted to remind you to please send your questions in, and we'll see you at 1:06.
Okay, I think we can get started again. And I wanted to pick up on this thread that Professor Oboski mentioned in his last comments, particularly about how we're seeing more and more people being willing to describe this epidemic of violence by the police against Black people as a public health crisis. And we've seen how police violence in particular has been one of the leading causes of death for young Black men. And I want to talk about, do you believe that medical professionals contribute to this system of over-policing and police brutality? Professor Oboski has a lot of great literature about this, including this phenomenon that's been called excited delirium, which I believe he describes like a fraudulent forensic science that medical examiners use as a way to justify the police use of force against Black people. So I hope you can pick up on that thread and talk more about what that means, and maybe also what it could mean for lawyers, especially who are trying to seek justice, whatever that looks like for victims, and maybe have to lean into this fraudulent science in order to play this awful game that we do in courts. And does that essentially just affirm the validity of this type of phenomenon?
Yes, so thank you for that. So some of my recent work has been looking at the role of forensic pathology and developing ways to determine the cause of death for people who die in police custody. So one troublesome trend that we've seen over the past couple of decades is this idea of excited delirium. Excited delirium is a psychiatric term or a psychiatric framing that is used to suggest that when an individual is in police custody, that folks become so agitated and so frustrated that they go into a form of kind of delirium where they, in a sense, die spontaneously because of a mental health condition rather than anything that was done to them by police officers. And it's an idea that was popularized in the 1980s by forensic pathologists in Miami, who was looking at the deaths of sex workers and drug users. And the idea that this condition is often precipitated by drug use or some other type of physiological failing that then leads to this form of agitation that leads to a mental health crisis that then leads to spontaneous death. So rather than examining the actions of police, the focus becomes what did the individual who died do? And we saw this conversation bubble up briefly during the Derek Chauvin trial, where his attorneys tried to introduce the idea of excited delirium at multiple points, and it was routinely shut down. But the research that I've been doing has been looking at the many times in which it has been quite successful in leading to a determination of a cause of death in police custody that, in a sense, says that the victim died because of their own kind of limitations and mental health circumstances, rather than the uses of force that were leveraged by police. And this is a really this is a problem for many reasons. But in particular, because excited delirium is not a term that is recognized by the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association. It's not in the DSM, and it's not in any other type of guidebooks that catalog mental health issues. And so this is to say that there is very little medical or scientific backing or justification for this idea, and that for the most part, physicians and scientific researchers don't take it seriously. Yet we see it being successfully used in legal investigations regarding the culpability of police officers when they use force. And moreover, we see a growing number of coroners and medical examiners using this as an explanation for a cause of death when people die in police custody. So this is all to say that we're seeing these type of kind of medical explanations for what is in essence a form of, or instances where police instances and police brutality have been killing people. You know, medicine has been stepping in to provide cover and to prevent accountability. And so a lot of my work is trying to shed light on this, to try to explain the history of these diagnoses, where they come from. You know, Professor Goodwin mentioned earlier, there is a long history of using psychiatric explanations to, in a sense, explain why Black folks who protest the social injustice are somehow mentally failing and somehow are, in a sense, not exhibiting appropriate mental health, right? There is a long history of that. And excited delirium is one of the more recent iterations of this. And so we have to have a conversation of how and why, in particular, American psychiatry has been so committed to this idea of framing Black folks as, in a sense, mentally incompetent, when in reality, they are often just protesting the social injustice. And moreover, while excited delirium has been growing as a tool for defense lawyers in justifying the actions of their clients when folks die in police custody, you know, it is also curious that we don't see a stronger voice from the medical community coming out to say that this is an abuse of psychiatric practice and has very little standing. So I think we have to be both aware of and seek more accountability by kind of medical professionals, or I should say, we should be more aware of how medicine itself is being used in synergy with law enforcement to not only kind of produce these outcomes, but also to make sure that the people who perpetuate these harms are not held accountable, and have a deeper and richer conversation for why medicine has been absent from these conversations and what these medical professionals need to do to make sure that their medicine, or to make sure that their practice itself is not abused in these ways.
Well put. Did you want us to build off of that?
Yeah, sure. If you have other thoughts on how medical professionals might contribute to over-policing of Black communities, perhaps also another perspective of the policing of
Sure.
Black people who
Well,
become pregnant.
yeah. Well, it certainly does happen in the reproductive health space. And we saw that particularly in the, well, two level set. So, one, let's remember eugenics in the United States, right? In 1927, the United States Supreme Court upheld a compulsory sterilization law out of the state of Virginia. And Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in Buck v. Bell said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, a law that was meant to deny reproductive freedom and autonomy to individuals in the state of Virginia were thought of as being unfit morally, socially, mentally, etc. A law which one might think would just be struck down, but it wasn't. Instead, the Supreme Court leaned into it and said that society was better off for allowing such laws to exist and better off to not have offspring of people who are thought of as undesirable from being able to continue their kind. And so this was not done without the complicity of people in the medical profession. And in fact, in Nuremberg at the doctor's trial, many people think about the trial of the Nazi guards and people in the military. Well, there was a trial of Nazi doctors as well. And one of their chief defenses was to say, well, how could you, prosecutors from the United States, prosecute us for this? Because our eugenics law is based on the one that your Supreme Court upheld, which was true. And in fact, there was a period of time in which lawmakers from the United States and those who were behind the eugenics campaigns were saying the Germans are beating us at our own game. We've got to speed this up. And as Fannie Lou Hamer later on came to talk about the Mississippi appendectomy, which was a euphemistic term for what was happening to poor Black girls, teenagers, 12, 13 years old, who were being sterilized, coercively sterilized, and without their knowledge or their parents' knowledge, only to find out later as this was inflicted upon them. And let's also be clear, the kind of like platforms of sterilization that implicate the medical field have also been enforced against Indigenous women, women in Puerto Rico, and we've heard during COVID, women who are trying to immigrate into the United States that are in detention centers. And thank goodness for Dawn Wooten, who is a Black woman nurse whistleblower who said this is just wrong, and exposed this. And more information is certainly needed from this space. But we know that, this kind of complicity and involvement, particularly in the reproductive health space, goes back. And, we're basing this in California. There is a documentary. I'll put a link to the trailer in the chat. But Belly of the Beast speaks to the coercive sterilization of women behind bars here in California, a state that actually has reproductive privacy ensconced in its state's constitution. So if it can happen in California, where else can these matters happen? And then I would just add to that, as Dr. Julian has mentioned earlier, just the sphere of policing Black women as related to drug use, and the disproportionate policing of that. That's done through the aid of nurses and doctors who, what Paul Butler said when I was presenting a project and he was a commentator on it years and years ago, said they're snitches. And that's right, snitching on their patients. And that has led to tremendous health harms and experiences that Black women have had.
I'll
And I
add
think
a little bit.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to just really just that last point that Professor Goodwin just made is so important, because over and over and over again, we've seen instances where medical professionals see themselves more aligned with law enforcement than their patients, right? And that is the exact thing that medical professionals should not be doing. Their first and only priority should be towards patient health. And we see too many times where they see themselves as more in step with police rather than their patients. And how and why that occurs is an institutional problem. And this is where I think, as I mentioned earlier, the role of carceral logics and how it seeps through all types of institutions: healthcare, social welfare, public health, all foster care systems. These carceral logics are not simply a law enforcement problem, but it's a cross-institutional one.
That's a little bit what I was going to say, but I'll put my own spin on it, which is simply to draw our collective attention to what we already know. But let me say it, that medicine and the carceral state, when it comes to Black bodies, are they're fundamentally concerned with control and like ignoring, like a very strange mix of controlling the body and ignoring the natural needs of the body. And, you know, one of the ways I think about this is as a Black woman and a mother, you know, when we were held in literal chattel bondage in this country, Black reproduction, especially the role of women and mothers in Black reproduction, had to be controlled, right? It was a question of like risk management and labor production and capital production. So the history of, you know, we talk a lot about now, we right now are talking a lot about how police have sort of, the police state of policing in general has grown out of slave patrols, right? And I think it's really useful and enlightening to think about that. But I also think there's a way in which medicine has grown out of the same sort of instinct that relates to chattel slavery in terms of controlling Black bodies and the risk inherent in not controlling Black bodies under a system of chattel slavery. And so there's a way that I think, just as policing today is related to slave patrols in the antebellum North and South, there's a way in which medicine, or kind of the dealing of the body in a medicalized way, is also intricately connected with policing, because we were talking about people who were literally owned, like the very nature of their existence involved being policed. And I mean, I certainly feel that as a Black woman in medical spaces, that there's some, I don't know, a dual pronged thing of like excessive control, but also like ignoring what I actually know and what I'm saying is happening with my body. And I think that is both carceral and medical, and it has very deep roots.
When it comes to health, criminal intervention can be enacted through, among others, mandated reporting statutes, and is often justified as being for someone's own good. Why is punishment so often our response, and what are some feasible alternatives?
Can you say that question, or could one of you type it in the chat? Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll take a stab there. Would that be fine, Jessica? You know, again, if we start from the premise that Black people have been policed from the very beginning, a system of a lack of empathy, perhaps let's remember what Sojourner Truth said so long ago. In a speech that people remember of Ain't I a Woman, most people think of it as something about chivalry. And she does talk about no one opens up a carriage door for her, puts something down for her to step on in order to avoid the mud. But what's very interesting is what's really powerful and missed in the speech is she says, and I bore 13 children, and nearly each one snatched from my arms, and nobody heard my cry but God. Ain't I a woman? Right? And so when we begin to just think about the sort of social constructions about how we value Black pain, we just simply don't. Right. And so there's just been the kind of normalization of seeing Black people as being under the shoe, sadly, strangely, in so many ways. You know, if one were to think about a silver lining of these times, and it's really hard when you just see the kind of rapid fire of how, you know, there's Black death and then there's Black harm that doesn't even make the news. Right? It's like, you know, you got to be shot 10 times and survive, or 7 times like Jacob Blake, and then you might hear about that. You don't otherwise hear about these other instances. And so if one could say a silver lining of these times is the fact that we can use the terminology of white supremacy, which during the Obama administration, people might have looked at you strangely to talk about the intersection of policing and healthcare and that being something about white supremacy. And they'd say that's race baiting. That just sounds like the race card because we are post-racial, right? Like that was such a popular framing. So if anything, what we've been able to do is have a more honest conversation, which I think still is shocking for people. And that they think people still think it is, hyperbole to actually talk about the structural, systemic, social, and cultural ways in which these systems have aligned and not really disentangled for any substantial period of time. I'll leave my co-panelists to break in more about that, but if it gives us any kind of way to understand this in framing, is to think about a Supreme Court case, the civil rights cases. The civil rights cases was a case before the United States Supreme Court responding to the civil rights legislation that Congress had enacted to further aid Black people shortly after slavery, right? This is shortly after slavery. And in the Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court says, well, it's time for Black people to stop being the special favored underneath the law. And it's time for Black people to just be mere people. And he's just saying slavery just ended like 15 years ago. And if the Supreme Court has already said, like saying, well, you all have been favorite too long, what does that say about this longer journey?
So I personally, I really want to hear Dr. Julian's thoughts on this because as a provider, I'm just always interested in hearing how providers think about and particularly observe their colleagues' interaction with law enforcement, how they think about things. So not to put you on the spot, but I'm really interested.
but to do it, that's okay. No, I've been thinking critically about the question because I think part of the, as you put it, the carceral logics that get perpetuated, and to Savala's point about feeling controlled and yet ignored at the same time, is because I think that there is this pervasive sense that that's perpetuated in the way healthcare providers are trained to not trust patients, right? To not take people at their word, to not believe people when they share with you what's going on with them, to have this consistent skepticism and to hold power, control, and authority that actually no, I, as this trained professional, know better about you than you know about yourself. And I think that is, as we talked about with intersectionality, that's even further exacerbated when it comes to a Black person, a Black woman, a Black queer or trans individual, that the locus of control providers are taught sits with them and not with the people they serve. And so I think if there were a true reorientation within at least medical spaces, I'll speak to specifically, but a reorientation of expertise, power, control, lying with the person you're supposed to be serving rather than with you, and that your job is merely to offer the professional expertise that you've been afforded to offer guidance, recommendations, and information, that orientation is really, I think, the requires a certain degree of self-critique that medical professionals are not taught to enact in, that are not taught to engage with. Because why would you, as a person who's privileged and powered, what incentive do you have to critically self-reflect on your own practices if you're the one who holds the power within the system? So, I mean, if we think about, one space I think about this again, we were talking about the criminalization of substance use and pregnancy and child protective services, is urine drug screening, urine drug testing within medical care. And often when I'm talking to trainees, they'll say, and a patient, let's say, discloses to them that she is an opioid user. And they're like, well, we have to get a urine drug screen. And I say, why? She just told you the substance that she uses. In what way, shape, or form does that urine drug screen provide you any additional clinical information that's going to allow you to properly care for this person? It doesn't. The only reason that you think you need to get it is because this person has now proven, because they use substances, they're not trustworthy. And so since they're not trustworthy, we have to perform additional testing, experimentation, medical procedures in order to get true information about them. And so I often, as I try to in my own practice, challenge folks about their preconceived notions for why do we do the things we do? And in turn, think about how can I use the tools at my disposal to actually help serve this patient's needs? So to use the same type of example, I'll often, if I'm caring for a person who's pregnant, who is a substance user, who's discontinued their use of substances for a certain period of time, I'll actually offer that person a drug screen. Because I know inevitably, especially if they're a Black person, inevitably when Child Protective Services is called as a part of their care shortly after they deliver their baby because they have a history of drug use, this will provide further evidence of their quote unquote sobriety and add legitimacy to their ability to claim parental rights for their child. So I think in the same ways that we talked about how physicians, healthcare providers can be implicit in carceral action and agents of the state in harmful ways, we too can align ourselves with patients and families and communities and think about ways to help further their claims for their bodily autonomy, their choices, their rights to their families, their children, and the things that they deserve. I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but that's what I got.
Yeah, no, this is the point that you're making about the way providers don't believe their patients. It's so critical, and questions of whether or not they adhere to advice and protocols and how that leads to poor treatment. And it really highlights, I think an aspect of this conversation that often gets ignored is the role of class solidarity that many providers have with law enforcement. So, for example, just because someone goes to medical school, it's not like that medical school training and residence disabuses them of all the pre-existing ideology they've been taught about race and racism, right? And if anything, medical training probably exacerbates some of those issues. So, a couple of years ago, there was an article published that looked at medical students and their understanding of how Black people experience pain. And half of the white medical students believed that Black people felt less pain than other people, right? And this idea that Black people don't feel pain has its legacies in slavery, right? So part of the explanation for whipping slaves extra hard was this idea that they feel pain, their skin is thicker, they feel pain differently than other people, so you have to whip them extra hard. And so we fast forward, several hundred years, and we see the manifestations of that occurring in how medical students think about the way they provide pain management to, or how it informs the way they might think about providing pain management to their Black patients. So a couple things. So one, it highlights the durability of racist thoughts, over time. And secondly, it highlights, how carceral logic. So again, perhaps those carceral logics that begin in doses of slavery, they then transmute over time into forms of mass incarceration, and then sediment in institutions such as medicine and medical training, how that shapes the way that practices move forward in terms of how healthcare providers think about their patients. And so it's another way of, I think, making the point that Dr. Julian was making, which is there are these kind of practices that stem from these other types of poor treatment or maltreatment of people of color that embed themselves within the field of medicine and become ways that become reference points for how providers interact with their patients that leads to forms of distrust and poor treatment and ultimately poor healthcare that then often becomes the baseline from which health disparities are created and produced, rather than thinking about health disparities reflecting something natural or inherent with regards to poor health outcomes in communities of color. And so we have to think about the role of medical institutions, again, in creating these differential outcomes, rather than thinking that these differential outcomes are just kind of the state of nature for how Black and brown people are.
Unless there are any additional thoughts that you want to share on that, I think we'll transition to Maya, who's going to be controlling the Q&A portion. We've had a few questions come in from audience members, so I'll hand it over to you, Maya.
Yeah, thank you, Serena. And what an incredible panel this has been so far. I am absolutely in awe of this conversation and so grateful to all of you for joining us and sharing your thoughts and your insight. So the first audience question picks up, I think, on a theme that came up in the last conversation about how Black people are often ignored and their pain isn't taken seriously. And so this question is, in what way do the politics of anti-fatness and fat phobia also intersect with the health system, with people being ignored in the medical field?
I feel like this question is directed at me because most of you know I write and talk about this stuff a lot, but I don't need to go first, but I will go first. I'm glad the question came up because fat phobia is so interwoven with anti-Blackness and our culture. They're really inextricable. And my experience as a person who is fat and Black is that they potentiate each other, right? They compound each other. They create this kind of double helix, I guess, of ways to be mistreated or ways that bias can pop up. And I think it's especially interesting to think about this in terms of COVID, where Black people have been disproportionately harmed. And there has also been a lot of fat phobia around COVID and how being fat impacts your body's response to the disease. I mean, I guess what I will say is just to make it very plain, I mean, one way of understanding the connection between fat phobia and anti-Blackness is to think about chattel slavery. And part of the way chattel slavery was justified, right, was by degrading Black people and having them sort of portrayed or understood as animalistic, subhuman, out of control, amoral, all of these things, gluttonous, right, lazy, that already kind of existed, but not quite so potently as connected to fatness, right? So over time in chattel slavery, you see fatness become more and more associated with Blackness and the negative qualities therein in the culture, and whiteness become associated with thinness, to the point that, like, before and after the Civil War, if you look in sort of women's magazines of the day, the kind of Vogue and Glamour of the day, you find articles like, they're not shy about it. They're speaking to white women readers, and saying, don't eat too much because you're going to start to look Black. Or, the only way, there's a sort of well-known in the circle, there's a quip from an advice columnist from one of these women's magazines from the 1890s that says, the reader writes in about complaining about her body and, what should she do? She's fat, this white lady. And she says, well, if you want to find a man while you're fat, you better go in blackface, because that's the only way to be attractive. In other words, you better make yourself look Black, right? So fat phobia is basically used historically and right now to kind of control white women. Like, you don't want to be like that. If you get too big, you start to kind of seem fat, and then you kind of start to seem Black in this way, and to degrade Black women, right? Look how far you are physically from the white ideal. So these things are deeply intertwined, and I think they collide, right, in all of these spaces. That's what the data says, right, in terms of bias, particularly in medicine. I'm not sure about the carceral state, but certainly in medicine, the same suspicion, the same ignoring, the same lack of diagnostic tools being applied, all of that applies to fat people and to Black people, perhaps to others too, but I'm speaking from my own wheelhouse here. So yeah, I mean, I think they're deeply connected. Was there another part of this question that I'm missing?
No, I think you've covered it.
Okay, yeah, I mean, of course, other people add, please. I'm really happy that it's being brought up though, because they are so interwoven in our culture. I don't know what to make of the Kardashians. They're kind of doing some, I don't know. They feel like they complicate this in a way I don't really want to think about too much right now. But yeah, anyway.
I agree. I'm gonna not give any more of my energy to the Kardashians. But I will offer, Sava, again, thank you for speaking to your lived experience and your professional expertise when it comes to this topic. I think too often, folks who engage in a fat politic, their scholarship and expertise is diminished even within academic settings as not being a real area of study and rigorous analysis. So I appreciate you bringing both to the table. I'll also offer that in the same ways we've talked about the way that Blackness is pathologized and the burden of responsibility for a Black person's health outcomes falls inherently on them, and an inherent fault, a lack of morality around who they are because they're Black. The same goes for fat folks in healthcare systems. And the same way there's a pseudoscience to support it by medical institutions, I think also exists when we talk about the obesity epidemic. And I know I'm in a minority amongst my physician colleagues when I offer these perspectives, but when we talk about BMI, body mass index, as a measure that's supposed to provide useful information about one's health status and health outcomes, we know that measure, like so many others within medical, in the medical tradition, are rooted upon a default body. And that default body is white, cis, straight, able-bodied, thin, and male. And therefore is no longer a useful metric for any person who doesn't fall within those categories. I think too, when you really look at the history of something like the body mass index, it was never meant to be utilized as an individual marker of health status. In fact, it was described by, I believe the initial, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but the initial scientist who used it was using it to describe population level phenomena. It was never meant to be used for an individual marker of health status. And so despite this being a widely known and accepted fact amongst medical professionals and researchers, it continues to be perpetuated as part of it's considered a vital sign. Your weight is considered a necessary metric for which to assess any other aspect of your health when you show up to a provider's office. Often when we show up for doctor's visits, you get your blood pressure checked, your heart rate checked, and you're weighed. Why? Why is that a necessary part of being able to assess your needs? Often when fat folks present for care, their weight is considered the end-all be-all explanation for any presenting complaint. And so further diagnostic workup and treatment evaluation isn't performed for folks. They're just told, you just need to go lose weight. And it also provides, I think, even further potential for harm where when fat folks present for care, they're automatically seen with this lens that Savala talked about gluttony, an abundance and extravagance and overindulgence. And so chronically, fat folks are not appropriately evaluated for eating disorders, for other pathologies, mental health issues that are all just considered to be unlikely, impossible for someone in a fat body. So those are just some of the examples. I mean, I could go on, but I think it again reflects another situation where a phenotypic characteristic of a person is decided to be the reason for their poor health, if they even have poor health, or are assumed to have poor health because of that phenotypic characteristic.
All right, so unless somebody else wants to speak to that topic, I have another question from the audience. And this one is a little bit long, so I'm just going to read it. Black bodies have always, in the words of Christina Sharp, been, quote, presumed vectors of disease, unquote. This is both historical and contemporarily true, as one must look only to the HIV and AIDS crisis, the Ebola outbreak, and COVID-19 pandemic, to name a few examples. Do you all believe in a reparation project that addresses the negligent treatment and harm of health disparities? And if so, what should a type of compensatory package from the government be attentive in order to provide competent relief for those health disparities? Thank you, Serena, for pasting it into the chat.
Well, I'll just jump in here and then invite my colleagues to add on that the comment is well taken. You know, if you think about the history of separate but equal and the draining of swimming pools after the day in which Black people were able to swim. So there are limited swimming pools in cities all across the country. And so one of the ways of accommodating separate but equal was that white people get to swim 5 or 6 days a week, or maybe like 7 days a week for 3 weeks of the month. And then there's like 1 day of the month that Black people get the pool. Well, on the days after Black people get the pool, it was traditional that they would be drained, they'd be scrubbed, and then refilled. There's an iconic photograph of acid being poured on a Black woman after she and colleagues are kind of staging a swim in. So she's the Black person, there's some white people, and the acid's being poured on her in the swimming pool, right? So there are a number of ways in which it's just been kind of implicated in our culture that Black people are, you know, the sort of disease that need to be stayed away from, right? That's why they need to eat in separate places than white people. It's why they have to sit in different places than white people do, and so forth, right? Drink from different water fountains. And of course, it's not always helped white people, because it's also been with that white people have thought of themselves as not being vulnerable to certain diseases, and therefore ignoring the fact that they could be vectors, and vectors that spread disease. And so what does this mean now in terms of, you know, reparations and making people whole can come about in a number of different ways, right? So one could think about free medical school tuition, right? One could think about free college tuition, right? Really, the sky is the limit in terms of thinking about how Black people can be made whole, and there are ways of connecting it to, you know, medicine. Something that would benefit everybody and not just Black people too, would be the universalization of healthcare, moving away from the systems that currently bring people into bankruptcy and that harm people's economic well-being just by trying to keep up with their medical bills. So I'll turn it over from there to the rest of my colleagues here in terms of thinking about, you know, what does a reparations kind of project look like within the health space?
Professor Goodwin, I'm so glad you brought up the story around swimming in Black communities and the history of discrimination, because it's so relevant to this topic. You know, there are all these statistics on how swimming in African, being able to swim is well, I should say, African Americans have lower rates of being able to swim, and oftentimes you see these conversations occurring where that is often attributed to Black people having denser bones and other type of physiological reasons for why we aren't swimming as much as others. But in reality, the answer is precisely what Professor Goodwin just laid out. We have a long history of discrimination that excluded Black people from having access to swimming pools and other outlets. And that has generational effects that we're seeing in this present moment that affect the numbers of folks who are able to swim. And the tragic thing about this is that every year we see all these stories of young Black kids drowning because they don't know how to swim, which is tied to this legacy of discrimination. So I think that directly informs the conversation as a conversation around reparations, because as Professor Goodwin laid out, reparations can take on many forms. And so one form of reparation might just simply be investing in Black communities in terms of parks and recreation to make sure that Black communities can have access to not only the ability to exercise and have physical activities such as swimming that can often help improve health outcomes, and to just to simply make sure that these type of basic life skills like being able to swim can be reintegrated into the community, so that when, you know, young Black boys and girls accidentally fall into a swimming pool, it's not a death sentence and they're able to, in a sense, save themselves. So I think that's one part of the conversation around reparations. Clearly, this has to be connected to other forms of activities, but this conversation on reinvesting in communities to address these historical wrongs is a critical part.
I love the question, and I love what my co-panelists have said. I just want to say I've long advocated that my employer transition from a framework of access to education toward one of reparations when it comes to making a law education more feasible for communities that we've wronged. But anyway, the other thing I want to say is the vector of disease thing is also true of fat people. And I point this out just to help underline the connection between fat phobia and anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness. Fat bodies, like Black bodies, are often portrayed in the culture as sort of gross or contagious, as if it's catching, you can get it somehow from proximity. Of course, that's not true. Fat and Black bodies are beautiful and whole and sacred. But they're not often portrayed that way. I think the question of reparations for health issues, I think this is Justin's question. It sounds like a Justin question to me. I think it is. It's such a good one, but it occurs to me that like one of the challenges if you were to try to push this through would be the fact that our culture, we like to offer reparations or even protection for things that we are pretty sure you can't control, right? If we think you have some control over it, then like you're on your own. We want to protect things that we think people can't help, right? Like immutable characteristics or things that were done to them in a way that victimize them. But we have such an obsession with individual choice when it comes to health that I think one of the things you would have to tackle is convincing people that health is not just based on individual choice, right? That poor outcomes are not just based on what people do or don't do because they're dumb or smart. You'd have to somehow get the powers that be to understand that there is, there's an involuntary nature to health outcomes based on how we've structured our society. Those are my thoughts.
All right, thank you. Another question is going back to this topic of over policing, and a lot of people have been talking about how do we, reduce the presence of police in our communities, and how do we solve this problem of police brutality. And one solution that's been brought up is having social workers and like medical professionals respond to calls that have to do with mental health crises or health crises, like physical health crises. But given the carceral thinking prevalent in the medical profession, this audience member asked, what are the risks associated with this approach? And is it just the best of imperfect alternatives? Is there another way to approach this that might be better?
I'll offer that I think what the risk is all of the risks that we've been talking about already. The risks of kind of that class allegiance that Professor Obagosi talked about between healthcare professionals, specifically between physicians, which I think is important to name, because the healthcare hierarchy in and of itself is another example of the perpetuation of a white supremacist capitalist frame, that physicians are at the top and all other healthcare professionals are below. But what I think would be actually a modification potentially on that approach that can help avoid some of that risk is offering training to people from communities to be first responders within their own communities to mental health crises. So rather than the approach of healthcare providers, physicians, social workers, others who are coming from other places into communities that they are not familiar with, they don't know who are the folks who are the what's the word I want to use? Not change agents, but those who are deemed to be the holders of power, knowledge, memory for that community, those who are considered most sacred, who are considered authority within that community, with no context or knowledge of that microcosm and dynamic, it would make far more sense for us to equip communities with the skills necessary to be able to care for one another without participation from any carceral institution. And only when someone is deemed needing of specific services that may only be located in a hospital or in a clinic or in a facility, does then that transfer occur. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of, again, moving the locus of power and control from institutions to communities, to self-care at that community level.
I think this is such an important question. You know, one of the most tragic things I recently saw online was a picture of a house with a sign outside that said, "Police don't shoot. A man with autism lives here." And it was a sign put on the front of the house to make sure that if anyone ever called the police because one of the house members with autism was acting in an erratic way, that police wouldn't show up and start shooting. And I just thought to myself, wow, it's such a statement to say that this is what families who have folks who who have autism or other type of conditions that might appear to some people as being an unusual type of behavior, that these are the type of forms of protection that they have to create to make sure that police officers do not misinterpret their actions as being a threat. And this, I say that to suggest that, you know, I think so much of this issue is trying to find ways that, whether it is a mental health crisis or any other type of community problem or issue, that the people who are first responders do not necessarily need to be people carrying service weapons. And so much of the kind of unfortunate situations evolve when the people who emerge are not only people who are not properly trained to deal with the situation, but they've been trained to use their service weapon as a mechanism to resolve problems. And that is what has to change. We have to find other ways. I really like this idea of training community members to be first responders. So people who are familiar with the people who are in their community, they know when people need particular assistance, and finding ways to do that in a way that is protective of the community rather than calling someone from outside. I think it's a really good idea. But even if we stay within a system where police officers are folks who are given kind of this kind of primary responsibility to respond to such calls, we probably need to think of ways to create layers to policing, so that there are certain situations where people who do show up to provide assistance to community members are people who are primarily trained in de-escalation and resolving issues, rather than people who are trained to use weapons. And I think that's the beginning of a conversation, the beginning of a much broader conversation about how we limit the amount of contact that police have with communities.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your responses to these questions. And I think we'll wrap up now. And we really can't thank you enough for participating on this panel and being here to have this conversation today. I think so many great points came up, and I think it gives us a lot of questions to ponder over as we continue on. But really, again, thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you to everybody who worked on putting this lunch talk together, especially all the members of the journals, BJALP, BGLJ. It's been a really great time, so thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Take good care of yourselves, everybody.
Thank you. We'll be sharing a link to the recording so you can watch it again and again like we will.